basically an imaginary number. Usually a complex number, I think just that it has an imaginary number and a real part of the number. So it could look something like A plus BI, which means there's a real part, which is the A, and then the imaginary part is the BI part. Now, typically this is kind of a little bit different. That normally if I wrote that, if I was actually a variable, I'd probably write that as BI plus A. But with imaginary numbers, we usually write it this way. It's considered a complex number. In most instances, we're going to treat I like a variable. So you combine like terms with it. We don't need to substitute the square root of -1 back in for it. We're fine with it leaving it as I for the most part. We'll talk about that in a second here. So if there's like terms, we're going to combine those. So nothing too difficult here. So basically treat all these i's like x's. So nothing like crazy going on here with this. So all of these will go together. Actually, in this one, do they all cancel? The i's? Oh, that's weird. So that actually becomes a real number. Just 19. So those i's will just all cancel. -3, and this is a positive 3i. So they would just cancel each other out. Whereas in letter B here, really the parentheses aren't really necessary. They're kind of just like extra. So we're just adding like terms. And then minus 1i or just minus I. And again, we write the I second with imaginary or complex for whatever reason. All right, our next one here, we're going to distribute this negative in. And then just combine our like terms, so 5 minus 7. And then here we'll distribute again, we'll take the real part first, so 15 minus 12 will be 3, and then these are like terms, so this will be 2i. So nothing special really going on there yet. So if you flip the page over, now again, you can use your calculator for what we're going to talk about right now, but I also want you guys to be comfortable with what's happening and noticing there are patterns that go on here. So this is kind of a cyclical thing that happens with I. So, talking about I and going up to like I to the 8th power. So there's a lot going on here. We'll talk about like what exactly is happening, and then that we can simplify things with higher powers. So I want you guys to be able to use your calculator, but I also want you to not depend on it. So I'd say right now, I'd say that right now I prefer you don't use your calculator for this part. So determining the value of i's like to different powers. Now I itself is just the square root of -1. The kind of the really, like if you left with no other information today, knowing what I squared equals is going to be really important. We're multiplying the square root of -1 by itself, right? What's the square root of -1 times the square root of -1? It's like I times I. Huh? not 1.
-1.
It's going to be -1. Those square roots are going to cancel each other off. So, and maybe you said that and I didn't hear you because you're muffled back there. But, so it's -1. So this is kind of strange. So I squared is -1. And the reason for that is because those two square roots will cancel each other and we'll just be left with what's ever underneath the square root because it's essentially this. And then this just cancels. So that's going to be one of the big takeaways from today is that I squared is -1. So if you know nothing else leaving today, hopefully you're comfortable with that. All right, I to the 3rd power. Well, we just learned that these two are what? -1. So the square root of -1 is I. So this is technically going to be -1 times I. So it's just going to be a -I. So we get I, then we get -1, then we get -I. And then I to the 4th power. We learned that 2 of them equal -1. What's -1 times -1? 1. So I to the 4th will be 1. You might say, well, that sounds more important than that I squared equals -1. I squared equals -1 is going to come up an awful lot in what we're doing. But again, your calculator should do this for you if you're in that imaginary mode, I believe. Now, I to the 5th power, we're basically going to repeat all this because I to the 5th is just going to be 5 square roots. So this is going to be 1 times, so this pattern is going to keep repeating. So this is going to be -1, this is going to be -I, this is going to be 1. So this pattern will repeat over and over again. So when we have a repeating pattern like that, when we have, it's a pattern of 4, because it's the same 4 things over and over again. What we do with this is we try to figure out where in the pattern we would end up. So what I mean by that is I would say I to the 8th would be the same as I to the 4th because it's a multiple of 4. So I look at 45. 45 is not a multiple of 4. 45 divided by 4 is 10. Oh no, it's 11, sorry. I can divide, I swear. 11, we get 44, we get a remainder of 1. What that means is, when it was 44, we would be at this spot. If we go one more digit over, like one more from that, we would be back here. So the I to the 45th power will be just I to the 1st. Because that pattern is going to return again and again and again. The 54th, again, figure out where it's in the multiples of 4. This goes in 3 times. This one has a remainder of 2. So 4, and then we go 1, 2. So we'd be -1. And I'll show you guys again on the calculator how that works as well. 999 divided by 4. Goes in 4 times. Wait. No, yeah, I'm right. This then goes in 9 times. So this is a remainder of 3, so this would be 4, this would be like there's a multiple 4, 1, 2, 3, so this is -I. So if you guys want to take a minute to grab your calculators and double check this. Make sure that your calculator does the same thing. Did you guys find I on here? Is it in the math menu?
It's like the second on the period.
What's that?
It's like,
Oh, nice. Okay. It's probably in there too, but it's easier to. So it's like the decimal point. So I to the 45th, is that what we did first? Oh, that's mean. Is that what yours did too? Oh. Did anyone's not? Yeah, what did you do? What did you do different?
I think 45 works for my 54.
45 worked for you?
Well, 54 didn't.
I thought it would do it for us. No?
For some reason it's working for me because
Yeah, I'm wondering if it's like a rounding thing or something. It worked for yours. Okay. Let me show you guys real quick what this is saying though. What's negative 5e to the negative 13 power? Does anyone or negative 5e, yeah, negative 13. Do you know what that means? This is like negative 5 and it's being raised to the negative 13 power. So you're taking a negative 5 and you're moving your decimal over a negative 13. So what is this number super close to? 0. This is like a really, really, really tiny number. So it's like 0 plus I. So I don't know why it's doing that. Maybe your calculator, some of yours are and some of you are. So that basically is saying 0 plus I. So let's kind of see if we can. So then I to the, kind of depends on maybe the problem. I don't know. So we want to know how to do this by hand then I guess as well. Just in case our calculator gets weird. Oh, there it is. It's not good. So apparently our calculator's not very good at this, but but at the same time this is negative 1. This was supposed to be negative I, right? Is that what that one was supposed to be? No, it was supposed to be negative 1. I don't know. I wouldn't use your calculator, I guess.
if we did I to the power of 54, it was somewhat sussy. Negative 1 plus 0 I.
Yeah, that's weird.
Also it said
Well, 0 I, yeah, I guess that's what it's saying, is negative 1.
Also it said
Ours doesn't say, it says minus 0 I, essentially. So it's negative 1. That's pretty sneaky or weird or how it looks, so. All right, so I'd probably suggest trying to do those by hand.
I wonder what I to 999 power is.
All right. So again, if you left with no other information, like if these were tough for you, I want you guys to leave with the fact that I squared equals negative 1. So we're going to use that in our next couple problems here. So because anytime I see I squared, I'm going to be able to replace it with the negative 1. Because that's just a value now we know. So I prefer that over an I squared. However, I don't want square roots. So we're not going to replace I, we're going to replace I squared. So I times a negative 4i. So this becomes a negative 4i squared. We just learned that I squared is negative 1. So I'm going to take this and I'm going to replace it with negative 1. So negative 4 times negative 1 is positive 4. Yep. So getting that I squared to be negative 1 is going to be helpful in what we're doing here. This next one we need to FOIL. have some like terms we can combine, so that 15 minus 8 now that I squared, I'm going to put negative 1 in there. So negative 3 times negative 1 is going to be a positive 3, so this is going to be 40 and 3, so that'll be 43 plus 7i. And again, this is just the way we typically write it, is we write that I term second. If you have it flipped, I would never take off for that. It's just kind of being in the right notation. And then here, don't forget we have to FOIL. Those middle two get to go together, they do not cancel. That should be a negative 28i in the middle there. So it'll be 49 minus 4. And you don't have to worry about factoring it all here with I, so don't ever think oh, should I take something out of that? Don't worry about that, you can just leave it that way. As we're just simplifying these. All right, and then this last couple of problems here, these last 3, this ties us back to our warm-up question where I asked you guys to get the radical out of the denominator. Technically, anytime you see an I in the denominator, there's a radical in the denominator because an I is just the square root of negative 1. So we cannot leave an I in the denominator. So that is a math no-no. So kind of like Trey pointed out in the warm-up, we can multiply a radical by itself and get rid of it. So if I want to get that I out of the denominator, I can just multiply by I. But if I do that to the bottom, I have to do to the top as well. Now please do not cancel those i's, you just put them there. I squared we know though is negative 1, right? And I don't, 4i divided by negative 1 would just be a negative 4i. However, B and C are a little trickier. Because if you just multiply by I in letter B, you're going to get the I out of the numerator and not out of the denominator because of that minus sign. I'd have to distribute that I into both of those terms, so that wouldn't actually cancel it. Does anyone know what would get it out of there? And that might take you back to radicals a little bit. This one's a little bit trickier. We use something called the conjugate. Yeah. Do you, oh, here, wait a minute, Patrick. Okay. Something called the conjugate. What the conjugate is basically the opposite sign of this. So the conjugate, if it's 5 minus I, it's going to be 5 plus I. Why is that a good thing to multiply by? Why is the conjugate, those of you guys can get ahead a little bit? There's no middle number. It's always going to cancel the middle number out. So if I take the exact same thing and just change the sign and multiply by that, those middle numbers will cancel and FOIL. We like that when that happens. So on top up here, I have to multiply by the same thing. So the top, I'm going to distribute that right away just because 10. And we'll end up simplifying that. The bottom though, like Trey said, the middle number is gonna cancel. And I'll show that on this one, but once you know that, I wouldn't even write them. I mean, if you want to, you can. So if you guys notice, these two will cancel. And if you use the conjugate, that will happen every time. Now, remember, I squared equals -1, so we want to take care of that. So it's this 15i on top, plus 3 times -1, and we'll simplify that in a second. On the bottom, this is 25 minus -1, because I squared is -1. So the top is going to be 15i minus 3, and the bottom is going to be 26, right? Now, I'm fine with you leaving it this way. Now that I've said, like, we like that I second, if you want to write that second, that's fine. So you can write it like this. Now, some of you guys, it's just killing you because 3 and 15, you can factor a 3 out. I'm going to tell you guys that's not going to really get you anywhere. So if you want to factor the 3 out, go ahead, but it doesn't really do anything to help us. Like, again, think a few steps ahead, chess match, like, and it doesn't really get us anywhere better. So we can just leave it that way. All right, last one here. We're going to, again, use the conjugate. What's our conjugate this time? 4 plus 3i. Now this one's a rough one because we have to FOIL on the top and the bottom. Remember, I squared is going to be -1. So it basically just changes the sign of that coefficient. And so we no longer have an I in the denominator, which we wanted. All right. Questions there? So it sounds like some of you guys have seen this before and then others of you have not, and that's okay. Like, let me know if, like, you know, if you're struggling with it at all, or if it's you're not catching on. I'm glad to go through things a little more slowly if needed.